pleasure to welcome you to this evening's discussion of the Interfaith family today with contributors to the Forward's recently launched advice column, The Seesaw. Before I forget, I'm going to ask you to silence your cell phones. You can live tweet to your heart's content, but turn your ringers off. It's my pleasure to say that the museum's public programs are made possible through a generous gift from Mrs. Lily Safra. More than a century ago, the Forward launched its storied advice column, A Bintel Brief, a bundle of letters. In his responses to readers, the paper's longtime editor, Abe Kahn, helped teach new immigrants, the Greenhorns, about what life in America was about. At the end of the 20th century, Seth Lipsky, creator of the English edition of the Forward, argued that his job was the opposite of Kahn's. American Jews had learned about America. What they needed an education in was Judaism. In the 21st century, the landscape has shifted again, as the definition of Jewish life has grown ever more complex. And this terrain, it's this terrain that the Seesaw is looking to examine. No longer are we talking about synthesizing American and Jewish identities. What's at issue now is something more nuanced and much more granular. It's how do I consciously navigate the varying levels of Jewishness in my own family and in my own home? To help explore these questions tonight, we have on hand three regular contributors to the Forward Seesaw column: Susan Katz-Miller, Rabbi Scott Perlo, and Laurel Snyder. Susan Katz-Miller is both an interfaith child and an interfaith parent. She's a former Newsweek reporter and the author of Being Both, Embracing Two Religions in One Interfaith Family. Rabbi Scott Perlo is a rabbi at 6th and I Historic Synagogue in Washington, D.C., a unique institution that reaches out to Jewish and Jewish-adjacent young professionals of all denominations and backgrounds. Laurel Snyder is the author of 5 novels for children, 6 picture books, and 2 collections of poetry. She's also the editor of the anthology Half Life, Jew-ish Tales from Interfaith Homes. Their conversation will be moderated by my colleague Samira Mehta. Samira, who recently earned her PhD in religious studies from Emory, is working here at the museum as a fellow with the American Council of Learned Societies. She's currently working on a book entitled Beyond Chrismukkah, Christian-Jewish Blended Families in the United States. The Seesaw is an interactive feature. People send in questions and the experts weigh in on them. We're hoping to recreate the flavor of that exchange here tonight. So we'll begin with a moderated discussion for the next 45 minutes or so. But if you think of a question, write it onto one of those index cards we handed out at the beginning. And I and Alyssa Strauss, the editor of The Seesaw, will be around toward the end of the moderated portion to collect your cards and pick out some of the more provocative ones. With that, please join me in welcoming the panel to the stage.
Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the panelists. All of them have traveled. And I thought we would begin just by giving the audience a bit of a sense of who you are and how you see the question of the interfaith family today. Gabe's already given us your formal bios, so I thought I would ask for an anecdote that you think is particularly exemplary of a challenge, a joy, or just a theme facing interfaith families. And some of you, your experience is more personal, some maybe more professional, so whatever venue you want to answer from.
I always have to begin with the anecdote of my parents and their relationship, because That's really colored my approach to this whole topic. They married in 1960 after 7 years of hearing that they really shouldn't get married because they were an interfaith couple. And they're now 90 and 84, and they've had one of the longest and happiest marriages that I've actually ever encountered. And so I think that has given me this very optimistic view on interfaith families and what they can be. And some people accuse me of sort of looking at this topic through rose-colored glasses, but it's a viewpoint that I can't really not have, because that was my formative childhood experience.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you for showing up in the middle of the rain. I think I'm probably the most junior by far in terms of experience person on this panel, having had not nearly the kind of credentials and accolades that the people sitting next to me have. But, okay, so this is about my family. I guess Susan started with her family, so I'll start with my family. I have cousins. I mean, at this point in time, we're only sort of waiting, I think, until my family becomes, like, my nuclear family becomes fully interfaith. But I have cousins, and my cousin Jim is the one who's related to me. My blood and his wife, Debbie, comes from the Midwest. She's a Christian woman. She did not convert when they got married. And for some reason, I guess it was like about 5 years ago, we were just all hanging out, and she said, "Scott, you know, I remember when you were about 11 years old, and you said to my children, I've never met other half-Jews before. You're the first half-Jews that I've ever met." And first of all, I remember I was sort of thinking, like, Debbie, wow, that was a full 20 years ago. Thanks for bringing it up now. But I also remember myself sort of feeling actually suffused with shame that that's the perspective that I had brought. I'm a conservative rabbi, so I have a fairly traditional approach to issues of intermarriage. But what was interesting sort of about thinking about it was that Debbie, as someone who was not Jewish, was actually deeply sensitive to how I addressed, even as a kid, her children's Jewishness. And as someone who is still not Jewish, every year, because she and her husband, Jim, are passionate vegans, I think that's the extent of their religious expression, they travel from their home in the Pacific Palisades of Los Angeles to Pico Robertson, which is one of like the thriving, observant communities in LA, to protest the Sephardic custom of kaparot, where chickens are killed in order to sort of stand in as atonement for people's sins. So basically she travels, like in LA, like she travels across major freeways in order to protest all of these people, and in my mind, like, what's more Jewish than that, right? So, but what's interesting to me as sort of looking at it is the way as someone who has never personally laid claim to Judaism, is clearly part of somehow or another this in a way that I'm not even sure that her husband is, who is the one who was born a Jew. And it's always been food for thought for me. So that's it.
Well, first, I want to say that it's funny to have a rabbi sitting on a stage at the Jewish Heritage Museum and consider himself the most junior member of the panel. I think I want to tell two stories, and one is that when I was in school, in college, and then in grad school, I found myself really lost. Because I had grown up in Baltimore. My mom's Catholic, practicing Catholic still. My father's Jewish. I had been raised Jewish in an intermarried home, and felt Jewish. But I went to college in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then I went to grad school in Iowa City, Iowa, neither of which has a huge Jewish population. And I sort of had a hard time figuring out how you break into, how you sort of penetrate a small Jewish community that knows itself and each other anyway. Like how anybody walks in the door of a new place and says, like, I want to be a part of this community, but especially if you feel like maybe the people in that room aren't sure that you belong there, which I think is something that, for me anyway, I carried with me because of having grown up in an intermarried home. And I should add that my parents were not, I was thinking about this when you were talking, my parents' marriage was not especially happy, and they did not stay married. And I think that probably affects some sense of how I see how I see all of these things. But, and I had in grad school, I had a particularly horrible Yom Kippur where I had been fasting alone. I'd stayed home from classes, but then didn't feel like, I didn't have the sort of emotional energy to walk into this place for the first time. And so I just was fasting alone in my sad little student apartment. And I got together with friends that evening when I was ready to break my fast, and I wanted to go out to like a nice dinner, you know, like I've been fasting all day, nobody knew what this meant, or what I was sort of, where I was in my head, and of course I'm like floating with like caffeine headache, and I said like, let's go somewhere nice, let's go out for a real dinner. And then there was this argument about like something was on TV that someone wanted to watch, so we ended up just getting a pizza, and I'm sitting there in the middle of this awful apartment watching like some football game or something, I don't even know, like some sporting event that I didn't care about, you know, eating pizza off a paper plate, and I just burst into tears. And it wasn't just that I hadn't gone to synagogue, it's that I was so completely alone with my experience. So that's one story. And I knew that there was a problem. Like I knew that I had to fix this problem. I had to find a place to be, whatever that meant. And then the second story I want to tell is that when I was done with grad school, but still living in Iowa City in the same place, and still not having with any regularity set foot in the synagogue, I saw a posting for a job at Hillel, that they needed to hire somebody at Hillel, and I needed a job. And I went in incredibly nervous. Like, how does the girl who didn't feel kosher to walk in the door of the synagogue, how does that girl walk in the door of Hillel and ask for a job? And I walked in the door and sat down and had the most amazing conversation with the most amazing person who offered me this job, welcomed me, and sort of created a role for me, not just as a Jew, but as a leader, like as a community member with responsibilities and tasks. And what I discovered was that the tasks were the piece that had been missing. That for me, like having to light the grill for the welcome back barbecue or carry the tray of kosher gravy or whatever it is, like that having the job to do was actually the piece that made it possible for me to then walk into any door. So it's funny to me to be sitting on this stage today as like a leader, like any kind of panelist or speaker, and I do this a lot now, to write books or to be a columnist, to be an expert in this field that isn't a field, because I didn't feel comfortable even, and that was grad school. I was 25, you know, like that I didn't feel comfortable even then to walk in the door of that synagogue. That I just needed somebody to tell me that I was an expert, being me. So anyway, I don't know, that feels important to me, the role of work and labor and task in creating comfort for somebody.
I really like that. I know that I certainly share that experience, and so I hear what you're saying, and I heard all of you talking about experiences and emotions, happy marriages, unhappy marriages, shame at comments to cousins, passionate commitment to veganism. And one of the things that Alyssa Strauss, the editor of the Seesaw column, commented about when we were planning this is how many of the letters that they get are really about emotion. They're not certainly they get letters that are about what do we do, here's the situation, how do we decide? But she said many of them are about the question of managing the emotions. And so, especially because all of you brought up emotions, I was wondering if you have reflections on whether there are real challenges in the emotions of interfaith family life. I mean, there are challenges in the emotions of family life anyway, let's be real, but particular to interfaith family life.
I think a lot of the columnists in responding to the letters agree and come back to 2 points. And one is the importance of, if you're in a couple, if you're whether you're parents or you're a young couple, to stand together as a unit and to help each other process those emotions together and to have solidarity. Because a lot of the emotions you're going to have when there's this very charged topic of interfaith families comes up, it's because you're facing opposition from either extended family members or clergy or religious institutions. And the importance of being a strong unit with your partner or spouse and agreeing on your approach and standing together, I think that's helpful. The other thing is the importance of community. whether that community is, a synagogue or, JCC related or a secular community, whatever that community is, it really is helpful to have a supportive community in order to process these charged issues. So.
Look, when you're a rabbi, there's just a lot of emotion. I have this superpower now, which is I can walk into a room and make everybody in this room feel guilty instantly. It's an amazing power, right? I didn't know that I was getting this superpower. I kind of hate it, but it is a fact of life. And one of the things I just sort of, I think that, yes, there are issues that interfaith families in particular deal with again and again, but I just don't see them as different in kind, only as different in degree than the issues that most Jewish American families or most American families in general. Everybody has deep feelings of being inauthentic because of what it means to be human or because of the time in which we live. And it's always interesting to me as a rabbi because one of the things that I end up learning about the study of Torah, right, is it's not just sort of technical knowledge for the sake of superiority. Like, the more you know, the more you're able to hitch your emotions, right, to actual pieces of functional knowledge and practice. Practice becomes a way of working out those emotions. But for people who feel like they don't know, or often, sometimes I'll be explaining to people sort of like what the Torah says, and based on where their emotional state is, they'll be like, no, that's wrong. And I said, they'll be like, and the fact that, my 6 years of rabbinical school, become instantly irrelevant. It's amazing the way they do it, and I can't convince them otherwise. And these are deeply intelligent, passionate, these are not, right? So what I want to say is that for anyone engaging in community, right, the struggle, logistics are only the way that emotions express themselves. And I think that's true in interfaith families, but in my work, I don't find that as different than in most families.
I want to say, first of all, that I have that same superpower, but I got it when I became a mom. And second, I agree. I think we like to say, and it sounds cute, and it's easy to put it out there as a sort of soundbite, to say that all families are intermarried families, right? All families are interfaith families. And I think the soundbite works, but the reason it's true is because all of these things are nuanced and specific to every individual. And when you think you have the illusion of simplicity in any human interaction, it's because you're not looking deep enough at the specifics, right? Like, so my husband's not Jewish. His name's Chris. It's not hard for people to figure out that he's not Jewish. And, but I was saying earlier, that's not why we sometimes have conflict. We have conflict because he's an introvert and he doesn't like to go to potluck suppers, and I bet there are other husbands or wives who've experienced that. It has nothing to do with whether he grew up going to church or synagogue. But I think it's easy once we have something, we say, you're a Republican and you're a Democrat, and we're going to hang this disagreement on that divide, or we're going to hang this disagreement on the religion divide, or whatever, when in fact, this is like one place we can have a battle, but we could find someplace else to have a battle too. And so I think sometimes you diffuse it by finding someplace else to have a battle. But more often it's just about getting to the nuance and sort of understanding that everything is a divide in a sense.
I realized I wanted to sort of go back and ask Susan, which is, do you disagree? Ultimately, do you think that there are ways that interfaith families struggle in ways that are really specifically different than the ways that people who've been born, within, like, both partners into a faith? I feel like, because you know much more about this from your work than I do.
I don't think the struggles are qualitatively different. I really think that couples rarely argue over theology. They argue over the dishwasher, how to load the dishwasher, and whether to extend the curfew. And I know.
Well, or they may argue about whose turn it is to take the kids to Hebrew school, but that's not because one of them didn't go up going to Hebrew school. It's because one of them wants to go to yoga and the other one wants to sleep in.
Right.
I generally want to sleep in.
And that's not to say that there aren't challenges of being an interfaith family. There absolutely are. Part of what I write about is that there are going to be benefits of being an interfaith family, and there are going to be drawbacks. And that I just want to emphasize that there are also benefits. because I think a lot of the discourse is really focused on the challenges, and I find that frustrating sometimes.
I'm glad you said that, because my next question, because I expected someone to say something about the particular challenges of interfaith families, was are there particular joys? And so if, I really hear what you're saying about the fight about who's driving the kids to Hebrew school being about who gets to sleep in, not about who grew up going to Hebrew school. But if you're arguing that there are distinct benefits and distinct challenges, I'm wondering if you could give a couple of examples, and if the other panelists want to chime in with agreement, disagreement, other examples.
Right. So I'm on Team Joy. I actually wanted to call my book The Joy of Being Both, kind of like the joy of sex. But the publishers wanted it to be shorter and punchier, so it ended up being both. And I was sad that they cut the joy out. But the subtitle is Embracing Two Religions. And the embrace part was really important to me because, when you're in an intimate family relationship, you don't tolerate the other religion or the other person. You embrace them. Otherwise, it's not going to be a very functional family. But for me, one of the joys is having multiple viewpoints on the world as your given baseline, and that, seeing from multiple perspectives, you have a sort of a more stereoscopic vision, as often the metaphor that's used. And I think in particular kids growing up knowing from birth that there is more than one viewpoint in the family, whether you raise them exclusively Jewish or Christian or with both or with no religion, they're still going to have that sense of interfaithness, because I think there's no way to avoid that. It's formative. Even if your nuclear family is exclusively Jewish, you're going to go to your cousin's communion, and you have to understand what that is, and you know that you're going to love those people because they're part of your family. And so I think loving across lines of faith is good for the family and good for the world. That's the way I would put it in short.
I think it's a really good question. I think it's not a question I've heard anyone ever ask before. And I do a lot of this. It sounds sad to say this, but because my parents split up when I was little, and you don't think of that as like a positive experience, but some of the ways in which our lives were simplified by the intermarriage. So like the holiday that was contentious was Thanksgiving, because my dad took the Jewish holidays, my mom took the Christian holidays. The only ones we had to think about were the secular holidays. So there were ways in which sort of it sorted our lives a little bit that I think actually in the long run, because it was a divorced home, simplified life. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's really a joy, but I do think that in some ways when I look at similarly divorced families where there wasn't that divide, there was more to fight about in some ways. And the other thing I wanted to say is watching my kids grow up with an awareness of this stuff. And it's an interesting thing to be second generation intermarried, right? Yeah. So I have my parents' example, but my children also have their grandparents' example. And they know that they are having their experience as kids growing up in a synagogue or in a Hebrew school or at holidays or whatever, but they also have all these other influences that come in. And that's really, in some ways, what may feel challenging in the first generation feels stabilized in the second, I think, in some ways. That, like, they're what they are modeling, I'm modeling for them. But the other thing that happens, and again, yeah, every marriage is an intermarriage, and every kid experiences more than one culture. But my kids really, really have involved themselves in kind of a dialogue about theology in a way that I think they've seen modeled in a home where you have multiple influences. So, they'll be in Hebrew school and they'll come home talking about manna in the desert, and one of them has taken a really literal approach to it, and the other one has a really sort of scientific explanation or sort of more sort of spiritual understanding of what that might mean. And they're 7 and 9.
I really wish I'd gone to your kids' Hebrew school. That's amazing. Manna in the desert, that's incredible. We were like Aleph, Bet, that's what we
there's
did.
that too, but no, they learn.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But the more to the point, they think about it and they talk about it and they argue with each other, and implicit in their understanding of religion is the argument. And I think it's implicit in Judaism too, but for them, it's so clear that they can disagree. These things can be in some ways sort of mutually exclusive and yet contained in the same family and in the same conversation. And that to me is a joy. Like when I watch them, when I listen at the door and I hear them fighting about this week's Godcast, or whatever it is, there's a huge joy for that for me.
I see that as well. I mean, in the survey I did of young people from interfaith homes who were actually learning both, but I think whether or not you formally learn both, you have both of those influences. I couldn't make a lot of conclusions about their identity because they were still very young, but one of the patterns that I clearly saw was that these kids from interfaith homes are very religiously curious and intellectual.
Nothing's automatic.
In college, they took Jewish studies, they took, Eastern religion. They were consuming and absorbing, and they have that sort of interesting compare and contrast. And one of the critiques is that it's going to be too intellectual, that it's not going to have the spiritual juice. But I think there are ways you can have both.
It's really important that you turn to text or classes or travel when you don't, like the story I was telling about Yom Kippur, right? But I could take Jewish studies classes. I might not feel like I necessarily knew I would be welcome if I walked in the door of the synagogue, but I could totally sign up for the classes. And so I took a Jewish studies undergrad degree, and I did a year abroad in Haifa, and that's sort of like those things you can sign up for that anyone can sign up for. You sign up for those things, or I did. And so I had exactly that experience.
Yeah.
I read everything that I could find, and educated myself in those ways because I couldn't take anything for granted. And there were huge gaps in my education. I hadn't learned things that I needed to learn.
Look, I think the friction is the birth of spirit, right? When you rub up against something, it creates an untenable sort of a feeling that has to be resolved through exploration. And if there is joy, and these people love each other, so it's a family. So there's obviously going to be opportunity, but it's because apathy is not an option, right? And ignorance no virtue. And I think that, because of Jewish spiritual ambivalence, which we are really ambivalent. If we had to define ourselves, we're real ambivalent. We can't decide on anything. And that's not just because of our genetic heritage. I think, so we do see a lot of interfaith couples go through like this journey together in which they discover something at the end of it that purely Jewish couples won't. Having said that, for people who are the children of interfaith families, I just find that there's a much higher probability that they will be shattered at some point in time in their life because of a comment directed their way, right? And they don't, I don't think that anybody in our time is particularly spiritually resilient, because if we really were as self-confident as we said we were, then someone saying to you, you're not really Jewish wouldn't really matter. But the examples of people who heard that when they were 18, 19, 20 years old, and then left for 5 years, for 10, listen, you're allowed to be upset when someone says something really nasty to you, but the idea of not stepping into a synagogue again for 5 years because someone leveled a comment in your direction, for 10 years, I think that is something that the children of interfaith families struggle with more, in a way that, we have to talk about at some point.
Well, we do, and I think that's why, for me, it's important for those interfaith children to have safe spaces in which to process that stuff early on and become aware of what they're going to face when they go out into the real world. And for my kids, that safe space was our interfaith families community, where they had support on both sides, and we talked about everything that they might face. And that's partly because I faced it, because I was an interfaith kid, so I knew what was coming for them. And so they're very aware of, which streams in Judaism consider them Jewish, which don't, and what they would have to do if they decided to become conservative or Orthodox. They know that they're going to have to go to the mikveh. I think the problem is when you don't talk about all that stuff, and then suddenly people are shocked by it.
Right. It's so true.
But it's hard to get around. I had a conversion when I was like 18, went to the mikveh, did the spiel, and then spent a lot of time trying to explain to people why I hadn't had an Orthodox conversion.
Yeah.
So like that's the question you get. You're like,
never
you're sort
good
of
enough,
proud of
is it?
yourself.
Never
You're
good enough.
It's never-
And they're like, which mikvah?
Right. And if you'd done Orthodox, it would have been
Inevitably.
right. Yeah.
So I mean, I guess that's the hardest question, right? Is this thing that we love, that we value, that feels important, that we've built walls around it because it feels of value, when those walls are just inherently likely to threaten someone or make somebody feel excluded. Like and I don't know, I have no solution for that, but like, yeah, that sort of I value everybody's Jewish experience, but sometimes it conflicts with my identity, period. There's just no way around it. And in some ways, I find it much easier to deal with people who are more from, because these are clear lines. Like I'm not Jewish to you, and I get that. I don't do things the way you do things, but can we have a really interesting conversation? And sometimes it's harder the closer I get to sort of where somebody is, then the friction is almost unbearable. Because it's like, I know you almost want to like me. You're almost convinced, but you're not quite there. And that's tricky stuff.
So I'm going to go a little bit off book. I sent them the questions I'm asking ahead of time because in the green room beforehand, we were having this really great question. Scott said, basically, as his opening comment, what would your ideal be? What would you want the world for interfaith families to look like? And Susan and Laurel were having, I don't want to call it a debate because it didn't seem adversarial, but a conversation. And I'm wondering if, I'm going to ask Scott's
We'll reenact
question.
it.
Basically, would you reenact it? Because it was really very
It was
interesting.
great
and I
because
think,
I was completely silent during that discussion. So it was working out well for me.
but I think because it gets to this thing that Laurel is raising at, I want to value everybody's Jewish experience, but sometimes your experience will conflict with my identity. And I think it also gets to this question of what kind of spaces do or don't raise people who are more resilient, because I think Scott's raising this concern that either kids from interfaith families are less resilient inherently, or they need to be so much more resilient for the state to exist in the Jewish world right now, and maybe the world. So if you would reenact, or...
Well, so the infamous Pew research study that came out in 2013 found something like 25% of intermarried Jewish parents raising kids partly Jewish and partly something else. So that's what I would call with both religions. And that was a higher percentage than the percentage raising them exclusively Jewish. Even though I would argue that you can never raise kids exclusively Jewish in an interfaith family. But this is a really important demographic, and I feel strongly that Jewish institutions need to engage with these families who are doing both. We want them to engage with us. We want to be connected. We want the content. We want our kids to have those experiences in Jewish contexts. And so my radical vision was that there will be synagogues that accept interfaith families without qualifications, without saying you can't have a Christmas tree, without saying you can't also educate your child in Christianity, which is the current policy in a Reform synagogue. And that there will be new structures to allow families who want to stay engaged with Judaism to stay engaged. Even if they are providing their children with interfaith education. The majority of kids with Jewish heritage now also have Christian heritage. And I just believe that more education is always a good thing, that interfaith education is good for everybody, whether or not you're part of an interfaith family, but that interfaith kids in particular need and benefit from education in their Christian heritage as well as their Jewish heritage. So, but I'm kind of way out on the edge.
I want to be on Team Joy.
Team Joy.
I think it's just really hard for me to conceptualize how a kid can successfully, and this assumes belief, and a lot of Jewish families, intermarried, not intermarried, do or don't believe in anything, right? I know lots of Jewish families. I know one family that that's very observant in many ways, but has essentially written God out of the prayers in Hebrew. And they recite the prayers without that piece because they're atheists, but they want the ritual. We're all doing it, again, they're all intermarried families, right? Like, we're all making this up as we go along in some ways. And so for a family where there's not actual faith as like a piece, I think that that makes perfect sense to say that sort of this is history, this is culture, these are interesting ideas. These ideas can merge and blend, and I'm Irish and I like St. Patrick's Day corned beef just as much as Jewish corned beef and whatever. For me, as a kid who thought about this stuff a lot, and as a kid who my best friend was Catholic. I grew up in Maryland where everybody's Catholic, and at one point we came home to our parents and we're like, Susan's Catholic and I'm Jewish, and so we've decided we're going to be Jews for Jesus, because we had heard about Jews for Jesus, and my parents were like, no, you're not going to be, don't tell people that. That sort of, that desire to blend those things is so strong, but for me as a kid even, I couldn't reconcile this idea that my mom believed, I did reconcile the idea that my mom believed something and my dad believed something else, but it had been given to me to understand that my dad's beliefs were my beliefs and that my mother believed something else. There's an incongruity there, but it wasn't sort of emotionally baffling to me. I think I've done a lot of work with a lot of people over the last 10 years who really struggled with being given both models, like religiously, theologically, who sort of, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I have a hard time understanding how you can believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that he is not the Son of God. And that ultimately is what it comes down to for me, that if you are a Catholic, if your mother's Catholic and your father's Jewish, and you go to church and you take communion, you take the Eucharist, that is the body of Christ, and then you go to synagogue, I don't understand how you blend those things. And that, to me, that's like the only piece that I can't reach past, but that if you believe in an incarnate God and you don't believe in an incarnate God, that's confusing for a 7-year-old. And as somebody who knows the Mass inside and out, because we didn't have extra childcare money, so I went to Mass on Sunday when I didn't go to Hebrew school. I sat there and stared at that crucifix and tried to figure this thing out, and the only thing that kept me from feeling really confused was that it wasn't mine to figure it out. Those mysteries were not my mysteries. And so for me, it's just a very personal thing. This isn't about the Pew study or sort of what's humanly possible. It's just hard for me to conceptualize how that works.
I think those of us who were brought up Jewish, I guess that's all of us on this panel, tend to see Christianity as very faith and belief focused, as a kind of a binary. Either you believe in Jesus and you're Christian, or if you don't believe in Jesus anymore, then you're not even Christian anymore. And we contrast that with Judaism, which is, more of the civilization and the people, and we all know there are a lot of atheist Jews even in, conservative schools. But I think that sort of contrast and binary is breaking down. There are a lot of people who actually feel culturally Christian now.
Yeah,
It's not really a category, but I was reading a blog post last week by a minister who's an atheist who's writing about it. And so, yes, a lot of the interfaith families that I think are making this work are families who see these stories, biblical stories, as metaphor.
Right.
They are not literalists, they're not fundamentalists on either side, and so they are offering their children all of these stories as inspirational or not. And some children, some individuals want and need clarity, and they will choose it and they will have it, and that's great.
No, I did a picture book last year called The Longest Night that's a retelling of the plagues for Passover, and we did a panel that was a priest, a rabbi, and me on the stage. And it was interesting that sort of the number of people, the bulk of the people who came And who also people who've written to me about the book are Christian families who are sort of turning to Jewish text as for that metaphoric sort of way of looking at it. And basically were saying to me, I have my kids in Sunday school, but I don't believe this stuff, but you got to give them something. And so the kids are in a very literal program, essentially, but the parents and the family and the household aren't modeling that kind of literalism. So that's,
Yeah, I want to make a case for, I guess, like literalism without fundamentalism. And I think that like one of the questions that is always on my mind, because I share a similar reaction, which is when someone gets up to the Torah, right? And this is something that's happening more and more and more, is that the non-Jewish partner, the Christian partner, the Muslim partner wants to get up the Torah and say the blessings over the Torah. But the Torah blessings say, Asher bachar banu mikol amim, who's chosen us from all other nations and given us the Torah, v'natan lanu et Torato, right? And the issue is not, the issue is not somehow or another that the heavens will split apart because someone who, doesn't fit the right kind of profile is standing up there. It's that the argument seems to be that it can be metaphorical but never compelling, right? Which is that the content of the two or the multiple religions that we're talking about, and and this is where I belie my own bias, which is I'm in this because I find it compelling, right? And ultimately, I think there are many, many ways to experience Judaism, including atheistic Judaism, cultural Judaism, but that is not my Judaism, nor the Judaism of the community that basically I personally sort of participate in and sometimes teach in as well. And I think that, at the end of the day, what we're talking about, it's not as if, my impression is not that it's just sort of metaphorical Judaism, metaphorical Christianity, but rather that they're being supplanted by a larger value system, which is American liberalism, right? And I, by the way, am quite compelled by American liberalism, right? So I'm not saying that, but it is neither, right? And so what we're talking about, I think, is people saying, I'm of these spiritual heritages, but if I'm actually seeking to figure out what to do, I don't know that they're turning to either of them. And that ultimately is, where you and I had sort of, I think, start to differ, if I understand it correctly, which I may not.
I'm going to interject for just a second, then I will.
It's not fair.
Only to say that in about 5 to 7 minutes, we're going to turn to your questions. If you need another index card or don't have an index card, if you raise your hand, Gabe has more. And please think of last questions and turn them in. Back to you.
Well, I just wanted to put this in the context of people are disaffiliating from religious institutions across the board, not just Judaism.
Right.
And, the biggest, the fastest growing group in, Pew Religion surveys is the spiritual but not religious and the religious nuns, N-O-N-E. And this is not being caused by intermarriage. This is
Certainly not.
everybody.
No, certainly not.
Right. So this is everybody. So I think we have bigger fish to fry in terms of, why are the religious systems that have served us so well for so long not compelling to more people right now? I personally find Judaism tremendously compelling. I also find Christianity compelling. And I don't feel that I necessarily have to only pick one in order to find it compelling. I understand that there are limits to participation, if you haven't made an exclusive choice based on the boundaries that are drawn by, individual denominations, both Christian and Jewish movements. And I respect that. But I think the question of what is compelling and how and why isn't it right now to a lot of people is a big question that interfaith families may not be able to solve that question, but neither do I think they're really causing the problem.
Can I go back to the original question for just a second?
I forget what it was.
Which was, what would
The
your
vision of the
vision be?
world.
Oh, yeah.
And so what I would like to say about that is, ideally for me, I feel like there was, in my childhood, a sort of push against Jewish content, right? It was sort of like we'll have a pizza party at the JCC, or we'll give out bagels on the college campus, or we'll get them by lowering the bar. We're going to make this easier for everyone to come in. And that's not the same thing as inclusivity, right? It's just lowering the bar. And I feel like what happened is it's like you bring everybody in with the free bagels, and that's not compelling. That's just a free bagel, right? And so for me,
It is delicious, though. It's a little like,
I don't know, it
Depends on
the
where
bagel.
you live.
depends
Right,
on the
I was
bagels,
in
that's
Iowa.
fair. But I often find in little locks, it's amazing.
There's no good bagels in Iowa.
Okay,
And I love Iowa.
what a great statement.
But
Book title.
the
Collection of
compelling thing about Judaism is what it has to say. And my nervousness would be, it's all about implementation, right? My nervousness would be, I want more content. I want the bars, I want the boundaries lower. I want it more inclusive, but the sort of stakes higher, and the content more. And I want questions to be asked and answered, not avoided. So I'm for your model if we allow for provocative questions and big thinking and sort of, high standards for understanding. And I guess the question is, if you sort of have a topic or you have a question, and what you're essentially saying is, well, this is one way of looking at it, and this is another way of looking at it, and then you allow for discourse, that's a model I can understand, where sort of somebody who is compelled by one way or the other more strongly can say, this, not that for me. What tends to happen, I think, that bothers me, and I once did an NPR piece about why I don't like interfaith seders and got all sorts of hate mail. But this thing that tends to happen where you water everything down to avoid offending anyone. Mm-hmm. And that's what I worry about when I don't want kumbaya. That to me is not what the reason for being here is. And I sometimes, when I read these studies on like, we're losing the population, they're not coming in, they're becoming atheists, or they're becoming just Jews. And my inclination is to say, then that's what they want. Like, I want content. I want hard questions. I want, when I'm struggling with something, to go to text. And I want a place that delivers that for me. And if families that are also engaging with Christianity want to be a part of that conversation, I will push against it and learn from that experience. But I would be nervous about a third grade Hebrew school class that is trying to avoid offending anyone by bringing in just the things that are most palatable to everyone, because to me, then you lose the content.
I completely agree. Yeah. I think that the specificity and the depth are tremendously important. I wrote a blog post called "How is Interfaith Pooram Different from all other Poorams?" And it's a trick question, and the answer is it's not. When my community of interfaith families doing both does Pooram, we just do Pooram. There's nothing Christian about it. And when we do our Seder, it's just a Seder. It's just a Seder. A Seder is a wonderful thing. It's a Jewish Seder. We don't mix in anything Christian. Right. And that's really important for the kids to learn the two systems with any kind of clarity. You know, you have to have separation, and you have to have the specificity, and you have to have the jagged parts that don't fit together have to be there. Otherwise, it's deforming both of them if you try to make them. That's why, I use a Venn diagram on my book. It's not just the overlap space. It's the parts that don't overlap are equally important.
Right.
So because I'm aware of time and I've been watching index cards go across the room, I'm going to invite Alyssa Strauss, the editor of the Seesaw column, up to ask you questions, as she does when she drops them into your inboxes.
Hello. So the first one falls under the we're all Jewish, or we're all interfaith now umbrella. And this is the question. And you guys, I guess, just raise your hand if you're interested in answering, and if all three of you want to answer, I will choose. I went to a Jewish day school. My Jewish wife didn't. I'd like to send our child to a day school. My wife fears that it'll make our son into a stranger. Is she being fair?
You take this one.
I have this theory about Hebrew schools, which is why they often don't work, especially like a generation.
We're talking about day schools.
Right, I know we're talking about day schools, which is why they often don't, why they were basically terrible, right? So there's only one Jewish activity for children that's negatively correlated with future Jewish attendance, which is synagogue religious school. At least it used to be, which meant that people who went to synagogue religious school were actually less likely to be Jewish participants later on in life. And I think that the reason is that people were basically afraid. I mean, the kinds of people that they hired were often not very Jewishly knowledgeable. They were either Hebrew speakers, but more importantly, they didn't really believe in the content that they were teaching. They would just sort of teach a Zionist Judaism in particular. And my theory is that that's the way it went, because the truth is, if religious school worked too well, parents were worried that their children would become unrecognizable to them. Right? If kids come home and say, and now we're going to keep Shabbat, right, it becomes a real challenge for the parents. What I'll say is, I just think that as you're thinking about, whoever the question asker, as you're thinking about this question, which I think is like a reasonable thing, right? It is reasonable for a parent to want to acculturate, acclimatize, to educate their child in a pathway that they personally find compelling, as long as it, on some level, opens them up to the world in such a way that they will make their own decisions when they are of sound mind and body, and maybe their frontal lobe is completely developed, which will not happen for a while. But having said that, I think that, like, I just want to say that, like, I would actually just decide not based off of theory or principle, but just by looking at the actual school that's available to you in front of you. Right? If the school is a good school, if kids actually are deeply pleased and happy about their Jewish experience, if they come out knowledgeable and educated with good academics, don't worry about sending your kids there. The issue is, on some level, that, like, I think that fear created an educational system that actually failed hundreds of thousands of Jews. And I just wouldn't necessarily give in to the fear. I would encourage you to think about, like, does this school fulfill the needs of my family? But also, like, does the school work? And if it does, I would just go with the individual example rather than the overall rule.
I'd also add that if the discomfort is not just like an objection based on the school itself, but on the divide between what the parent feels their maybe lack is and what the kid is going to get, which I run into that already. Like, my 9-year-old knows things from Hebrew school that I'd never learned, and that's when your kid corrects you. It's a little bit disconcerting. I feel like the solution there is adult education, and not necessarily in a formal way, but just like to say, like, this is awesome. We're all going to learn more stuff that we didn't know before. And having a kid in school does that anyway. Like, I know more about World War I right now than I ever knew, because my younger son's obsessed, and we have a trench in the backyard now.
Oh, God.
But, like, it is a humbling opportunity when your children start to learn things you don't know. But it can be like, when they correct you, it can be really embarrassing. So I understand the instinct, but I feel like it's an opportunity, unless the parent really, really objects, that, like, and that is something where intermarriage, like, you know, watching my husband read picture books to my kids with words in them that he didn't understand, there's a huge vulnerability there that you have to get past. But again, we all have it, you know? It's not just an intermarriage thing.
Susan, any thoughts on this one?
Well, I would just say Scott's point that, you know, find out if it's a good school. For a lot of interfaith families, I think this points out that often we make decisions about the identity and the practices in our families that are based on just the realities of our geographic availability of different communities. And in New York, you're really lucky because you have, you know, 100 Jewish communities to choose out of, and 100 Christian communities, and you have interfaith family communities here that you can be part of. But if you're in Kansas and you're an interfaith family, often you have to make a really practical decision, and it's not really a theological decision.
But also a non-interfaith family often has to make those kinds of practical decisions.
True, yes, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is, what do you tell children or even adults who express feelings of shame about being interfaith? Sounds like some of you, Laurel has gone through this herself. Scott, I have to imagine, as a rabbi, you have, well, you don't have members of your congregation, but you have people come up to you and express these feelings. So, does anyone want to start?
When I started working for Hillel, I went to, you have to do like a new professionals conference thing where they send you with your whole, like, the new incoming class of, like, first-year Hillel workers goes away for a weekend at a kosher resort, basically. And we were in this circle, get to know you games or whatever. And I said it, I just said it. I think for me it broke the seal. When I took the Hillel job, it broke the seal for all this stuff for me. And whatever shame there was, it was. But also, I'm just a loud, extroverted person, and I tell people things I probably shouldn't anyway. And so I said in this circle, like, well, I live in Iowa, I'm from Baltimore, my dad's Jewish, my mom's not, blah, 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 blah. And one by one, 6 other people of this group of 30 came out and found me over the course of the next couple of days and secretly were like, don't tell anybody else but me too. And one of them had like just finished his IDF service. And he told this really poignant story about how he had been in Israel and he'd been doing his service, and his mom was actually like, I think Presbyterian, but his mom was a minister. And it had made him really happy to know that he was like the only guy in the IDF with like a Presbyterian church in wherever it was, saying weekly prayers for him while he did his service. And I was like, that's a beautiful story. Like, that's the kind of story we all want to have. But he wasn't allowing himself the particularities of his experience because he was ashamed. And it just was, I feel like that was sort of when I was like, this is clearly what I'm gonna do now. Like, is I'm gonna do this interfaith thing out loud. I really feel like the minute you tell somebody you have shame, you let go of it, or you begin to let go of it. It's just such a part of the process. So I think that's my best advice, is just tell some, like, if you feel like that, tell people. and then they will say, either they will say, well, you should be ashamed, in which case you walk away and find somebody else to talk to, or they say it's crazy, and then you feel better. So I don't know.
I'm really hoping that this is no longer going to be an issue when we have a majority of kids with Jewish heritage are from interfaith families. I think, our generations were more likely to have that kind of experience. But I also think this is a reason why I am pushing Jewish institutions to create space for interfaith children to tell their stories and to be out and proud and all of that. And often there hasn't been that kind of space because, interfaith families have challenged, our existence challenges the models the way they have been and creates fear about blurring of boundaries, fears about funding sources sometimes. And I think that the pendulum has to shift now. We have to get through this paradigm shift as interfaith families become, the demographic majority of Jewish-involved families.
I don't know, Susan. I mean, I totally concede the demographic point. Do you think that, there are not points in time in my life when I am with colleagues who are more observant or traditional than I do not feel shame about not being a real rabbi?
Oh, sure,
No,
sure.
I'm sorry, it's more of a rhetorical thing. What I want to point out is a few things, and because I think you're right about American Judaism in particular. But shame is the subjective relationship of a person to their circumstances, informed by opinions by the outside world, not dictated. In the sense that shame is what we generate based on how we relate to what people are saying to us. And I think that, the problem, even as American Judaism changes and changes and changes, we're still part of a world Jewish community, and we're still part of a Jewish community that goes back into the past and forward into the future, right? And the influence of that inheritance and that relationship is always going to be there for us, right? I mean, especially as Israel gets pushed further and further to the right. And what I'll say is that, depending on the person, depending on the thing, because I found that when I say to people, don't feel ashamed, that's like telling someone who's worried, don't be anxious, right? It's my general response at this point in time is to start learning Torah with them.
Yep.
Right, because it's it basically says some version, it's my only way of saying, with the paucity of the vocabulary that I have as a human being, as a rabbi, this is the only way that I can say, even though as a conservative rabbi, I don't consider everybody who comes through my door Jewish by a halachic definition, but it's my only way of saying I see you. And I think that ultimately the thing that I'm trying to work with some of our students is that deep hunger for the external validation that someone dressed in black with a black hat is going to turn to them and say, "You're a Yid," right?
Right. I'm still waiting for that.
Right.
I'm waiting for that my whole life.
And I'm waiting for one of them to say, and I respect, and I call you, I'll call you Rav when you come to the Torah. Ultimately that's it. I know that's not the point we're making.
No, but I hear what you're saying. I don't feel shame because what I see is many streams of Judaism that don't agree with each other about who's a Jew or what I should do to conform or be called a Jew. And so I have decided to be who I am and to respect that as a conservative rabbi, these are your rules and the way you see me and the way you see other people. But I don't have a negative reaction to that. I feel like this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. And I have roles to play in the Jewish community, and I have rabbis who do see me as a Jew. And so I think you seek out the people that affirm your identity, and that's part of building that confidence. But also just respecting that there are different systems with different rules in play simultaneously, and that's just where we are in Judaism right now.
Can I add one thing, which is, I think what you said about Torah is really important, even for those of us who didn't grow up within a tradition where they were actively learning Torah, that it's something that in my adult life I've come to that this is the thing that equalizes all of us. This text is what it's about. And if this text isn't what it's about on some level, there's nothing. So
can you come speak in my synagogue? That would be great.
So I don't know what I'm doing, right? I'm not a rabbi, but when I sit down with the text and somebody who knows it better than I do, not only the thing you said that I see you, I respect you, that's great, but also this is how you get to be Jewish. This is the thing that makes you Jewish. And so mikvah, no mikvah, conservative, Orthodox, whatever. You can come to the text or not come to the text. It's your choice. And you'd want to not come to the text, fine. Now go be embarrassed about that. Or don't. But I feel like that's really important, and I've never heard anybody say that out loud. That if that's the answer to the embarrassment of not feeling kosher, is to say, read with me. That to me, that's it. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, do we have time to respond, or should we go into? So I'm about to make the mistake of telling you about yourself. I read your book, and I think the question about how I am always shocked by how professional, driven, accomplished, incredibly well educated, financially successful people we're so fragile. Ultimately, and I'm constantly wondering about the journey from fragility to resilience, right? From shame to, I'm not sure actually and one of the things I want to say is you actually took your two hands and created the community that you saw out of it, and I just think that, to be honest, that has to, I would not guess that is also part of the process of moving from a place of feeling shame. Is that idea of actual spiritual empowerment, because the demographic, as you pointed out, is that the majority are from interfaith families, but there's still a lot of shame out there, surprising amounts of shame out there, and I just feel, and this is where the Torah thing is important. At some point in time, if you want to get over shame, right, grab it with both hands, and something happens.
I do think you have to be empowered somehow, and if that's reading texts, I think texts are central, but and we do that in our community. There's a reason why I had my kids get up and read from the Torah when they were 13, and we can have a debate about whether that was a real bar mitzvah or not, since they only have one Jewish grandparent and it's patrilineal. But
luckily, bar mitzvahs are completely made up anyway.
Right, that's what I write about the fact that there are really no rules about it. But I didn't really care who thought it was and who thought it wasn't. I wanted them to read from the Torah. I wanted them to have that, to get up and have that experience, and hopefully have it, multiple times in their lifetime. But yes, for me, definitely it's empowering to create our own utopian world where we're doing this, which is what we've done. But the intention was not to do it instead of everything else that's come before. The intention was to have a model of linking back to everything that's happened before and to try to move forward and weave connections back into our communities of origin. And I don't know if that will happen or not, but I hope it does.
Thank you, that was great. We actually have to wrap things up, but I'm going to take this pile of questions home with me, and they are going to be submitted to our columnists on the Seesaw.
That's a good idea.
You guys should all read on theforward.com. And we have books for sale up front. Thank you so much for coming, and the conversation will continue and continue. Thanks to all of our columnists. Thanks to Samira for leading it, and have a good night.